I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, and I will now form a government that can provide certainty and lead Britain forward at this critical time for our country.
Outside number 10, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, whose decision to hold a snap election, as you may have heard, has backfired. Her Conservatives lost their majority in Parliament. May's future as Prime Minister is now in question. Labour Party's Jeremy Corbyn was the spoiler. Like Bernie Sanders stateside, he energized a lot of young voters, many of whom were uneasy about the result on the Brexit vote and the upcoming start of the Brexit talks. The election is another blow to President Trump's anti-globalist message after the loss of Marine Le Pen in France, and could be a preview of what is to come in Germany, where Angela Merkel's popularity is surging a bit as she seeks a fourth term. It all seems very complicated, but at the same time is actually very simple. I'm joined by Gillian Tett, U.S. Managing Editor for the FT, Financial Times, and Niall Stanage, White House correspondent for The Hill. Welcome to you both. Gillian, you get the unfortunate task of explaining to a U.S. audience what a hung parliament is, how you can be Prime Minister May, remain in office, but maybe not remaining in office. What's going to happen?
Well, essentially what's happened is that she needed to win a clear majority of all the seats in Parliament to be able to rule without having to go into a coalition. And she has failed to do that, and that is a huge shock. So essentially that's what they mean by the hung parliament. And the only way that she stays in charge is by essentially forming an alliance with the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, which are the Protestant wing, the pro-British wing of Northern Ireland. Now, it looks like they have some kind of deal to form that grouping. But one problem is that the DUP have said they want to have a customs union with the European Union to make sure that Northern Ireland and Ireland can continue doing their business. That totally flies in the face of the line the government's been taking on Brexit. And the bigger problem, though, is that essentially the British people have said they're not very pleased with what Theresa May is doing. She's really lost credibility. And what's really striking has been this huge explosion of youth voting saying very clearly, we don't like the status quo. And in some ways, Theresa May is an awful lot like Hillary Clinton. Clinton campaigned on the slogan, stronger together. Theresa May tried to say she was strong and stable, but that was really all about the status quo, which young people have said no to.
Now, Niall, forgive an ignorant-sounding question. Can there be a redo on the Brexit vote? Is that fixable, changeable at this point?
Theoretically, it is possible, Brian, but it is highly unlikely for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the Conservatives remain very firmly pro-Brexit, but the Labour Party kind of sat on the fence on this issue, to be honest. It was only the Liberal Democrats, the third and smallest of the main parties in England, that was really anti-Brexit in a very definitive way. So some form of Brexit will go ahead. Mr Corbyn, the Labour leader, was favouring a softer approach to that in terms of the negotiations, which are only, Brian, about 10 days away at the beginning of those negotiations. Yeah. So that really points to the importance of all this uncertainty that we're seeing.
There's a short fuse. Andrew Sullivan has written what is, to my eyes, just a superb piece in New York Magazine for, admittedly, an American audience, explaining what we've witnessed here and in the UK. And I'll quote from a part of it. This week, Trump slumped to the lowest approval ratings of his term, in the upper to mid-30s, while being called a liar by the former head of the FBI. And Prime Minister May was humiliated, there is no other word for it, by the British voters in a snap election. In the wake of Brexit and Trump, the forces of reaction in Europe have also seemed to recede. Gillian, do you agree with that? We were seeing a kind of dark wave for a while.
Well, I think what's particularly interesting is that on Sunday, France goes to the polls again to see whether their parliament will essentially back the surprise election of Macron in France early this year. And Macron is a centrist candidate. He's very much a globalist. He wants to forge ties with the rest of the European Union. But he did that by essentially creating a new party. He essentially created this whole new movement, seemingly out of nowhere. And it's a very positive way of saying no to globalism, no to extremism, no to nationalism, but not doing that within the old wrappers of politics, finding a whole new vehicle, if you like, to express a centrist, liberal, globalist point of view. And I think that's got a lot of lessons for the rest of the Western world right now, because people can look at the Republicans and Democrats and say, well, they both look pretty broken. They can look at the UK political scene and say neither the Tories nor the Labour Party looks very convincing. Maybe, just maybe, it's time to start looking for new political vehicles like En Marche in France.
Niall, you know us well enough to please forgive us. We're Americans. We often need things explained in American terms. Do you buy this comparison that Prime Minister May is more of a Hillary Clinton figure and Jeremy Corbyn could be cast in the role by Bernie Sanders?
I do take that point, Brian, very much so. I think one of the interesting things here is the moral victor, though not the actual victor in the British election, is clearly Mr. Corbyn. Now, he is ideologically and temperamentally completely opposite to someone like Donald Trump. But what he and Trump have in common is this capacity to present themselves as anti-establishment, anti-status quo. In his policies, he's much more like a Bernie Sanders figure. He shares those kind of insurgent values. He sparked, Corbyn did, the kind of youth enthusiasm that we saw here. So I think there are a lot of comparisons. One of them also, Brian, being this, I think, increasingly debatable idea that more centrist candidates are axiomatically more electable. I think that thesis, as it applies either in Britain or the United States, is increasingly questionable these days.
I want to thank you both. While the jet age has shortened the pond, sometimes politically we seem worlds apart and hard to understand, and you've helped us out greatly tonight. We'd love to have you both back. Gillian, Tett, Niall Stanage, thank you very much.